3 is like staff playing and has a lot of things. I kind of need to probably just do my staff or something, but we'll probably like it. Not really traditional, so yeah. What someone else
That's white. We got it.
Okay.
Mitch.
I think for some reason I think it's like the boys maybe the boys that hey, I'm sorry that oh, I just thought you were going to sound like I thought you were going to sound like a speaker. Yeah, I think he's over there. I can't see him then.
It's this one.
Yeah, you kind of look like
What?
2019.
You'll get audio. These mics are hot.
That's what makes
You'll get audio.
Yeah. And everyone else will be.
You're fine.
I think it'll be fine.
Yeah, I think it'll be fine.
All right.
Good?
Like Steve Harvey when he is on Family Feud and it's like, is that your real voice? Like, there are times on Family Feud when he's interviewing a contestant and he goes, is that your real voice? I'm not even kidding, that's
awesome. Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks for coming out. We have a lineup of great seminars tonight, and we're really excited for you to take them in. Our first seminar, I'm going to introduce each speaker as they come up. So our first seminar tonight is called My Solving Journey, from our very own Sam Richard, who is a Rubik's brand ambassador specializing in education and motivation. And he shares about his miraculous story on how the Rubik's Cube helped him overcome academic and social challenges, which is what he is going to do for us tonight. And so without any more commentary from me, I'll hand it over to Sam.
Hello everyone. I have been solving the Rubik's Cube since the summer of 2009, and before then I had a very interesting childhood. The Rubik's Cube saved my life in many ways, and I'm here tonight to share my story. Life before Rubik's. Puzzles were a therapeutic toy for me growing up. I would always just rather look at puzzles more than video games in life. It got me to the point where I want to try something new, something harder, the world's most hardest puzzle, the Rubik's Cube. But in my experience with the Rubik's Cube, the world's most hardest puzzle is not the Rubik's Cube. If any puzzle can be solved, there's no such thing as the world's hardest puzzle. Growing up, I had always had a love for art and shapes. I would love to see how trees are shaped, how just things are together in 3D. It got me to the point in life where, how can I figure out a Rubik's Cube? I had no friends or family who could solve a Rubik's Cube. So then I'm like, okay, I gotta advocate for myself. I gotta figure it out. I then was able to answer my own questions and grow my brain. In a few minutes, I will be talking all about my brain. But growing up, I had always had a love for math. Math, to me, was more easy to understand than history class. History was just facts, but math in my life was analyzing, understanding, and connecting the dots. And the Rubik's Cube is just that, connecting the dots of notation. And growing up, life was very difficult for me in school. I was bullied, I was hurt, I was just in despair in life. Like, why me? Why this? Why is this happening in my life? The Rubik's Cube saved me in all that. And growing up, I was not strong, but I was determined. I remember one time in elementary school, I believe this was in 4th or 5th grade, I remember that I was the smallest kid in my class, and we played kickball one day. I caught the ball from a kick from the biggest, most strongest person who would kick the ball. And everybody thought, like, wait, you just caught the ball? Like, I should not be able to do that. And one time growing up, I played basketball, and the entire room, everybody I was against, all the parents of the players, everybody in that room knew me, but they did not expect my abilities. I outshined what they thought. On my birthday this one year, I got my first basket in a game, and everybody was just like, did he just do that? Like, wow. And that taught me, like, don't let what other people talk about you. Just grow beyond that, and you can really grow in life. The Rubik's Cube helped me in that to show how I can just shine with passions. Passion is the greatest thing anyone can have, especially when it comes to the Rubik's Cube. And growing up, I dealt with shyness. I did not really have a social group in life. It was really hard to make friends my age. It was easier to make friends with adults and kids who are 10 plus years younger than me. But then, I had my first competition in 2014. When walking into this competition venue, which was the national competition in Jersey City, New Jersey, I remember there was a table with an empty seat. And I go like, hey, can I sit down with you all? And they're like, sure. And I started to race them and exchange algorithms to get better and faster. And it got me like, this is cool. This is my social group. I fit in. And why fit in when you're born to stand out? And I could fit in that group, and then could stand out later on. You just have to put like if you are a piece of a Rubik's Cube, you have to be solved for that piece, and then everything else comes together. The year of 2009 was the hardest year of my life. I dealt with a lot of confusion in life, like, why is this happening to me? Why am I being bullied? Why? Like, it was really hard, but I am grateful to be where I am. And in that, with jealousy, I had a time with my sister, and I just felt like, why would my parents be ignoring me, but they are really not ignoring me? That confused me, and that year I needed a friend in that moment. And then that's like about the time when I found the Rubik's Cube. The Rubik's Cube became my best friend. It helped me socially with all the anxiety that I was struggling with. It helped me just breathe, just have fun with it, just enjoy your passion, enjoy your now. It took me 13 years from solving the Rubik's Cube to get to where I am now. I have never thought I could become a brand ambassador for Rubik's. It got me like, wow. I never thought dreams could come true. And by miracles, they can come true. But it's not just miracles, it's passion. I view this. Practice, patience, perseverance, produce progressive, professional perfection. That is a tongue twister. And tongue twisters being puzzles, so I love all that. And with another, like P word, puns. I'm all about puns and just having fun with word challenges and how things can relate. Back in 2009, I felt worthless. I felt like, why? Just why? I lost many friends. I had one friend just disappear on me in life. And a few years ago, we got reconnected. And he is still my best friend. But he has always supported me behind the scenes. So even that, with all the challenges in life and friendships, just let what happens happen, but then growth will come about. I was lonely, but I only felt that I was lonely. Don't let your feelings overtake you. Just grow with all that. And like I said, I had no friends, but my best friend being the Rubik's Cube. It taught me, it helped me advocate in life. It helped me to just get better socially and academically. Academically, in that I just needed to figure out school. I hated school. Why did we have to take tests? Why did we have to study? That just did not seem important in my life. I then just realized, okay, I'm learning this, I'm studying. The Rubik's Cube helped me in my studies, where, like I said, I have no friends or family who could solve a Rubik's Cube. So then I had to advocate for myself and answer my own questions that I had all about the cube. That rewired my brain. That got me to the point where I love school. I'm getting straight A's in high school. How is this possible? And passion drove me to where I am. And then, in 2009, in the summer, I met someone at a camp who could solve the Rubik's Cube in 15 seconds. That got me like, okay, if he can do that, so can I. My Rubik's Cube adventure and journey began with the 15 puzzle, the like flat sliding piece puzzle, where there's an empty spot. I could do that really fast in like an average of like 45 seconds. And I thought, if I can do that fast, and my friend can do the Rubik's Cube in 15 seconds, then I believe I have the brain power for it. And sure enough, I do. With the Rubik's Cube, I average 30 seconds right now. And even though I am not elite status, I consider myself to be, in my point of view, with my story. Which, in the next slide, I will be really revealing my story. But I grew up with a special education program for an IEP. And that got me, like, I may have an IEP, but does the IEP have me? No. I wanted to just fight that. Not fight the school system, but be better than being defined having one. And I became ambitious in many things, and nothing holds me back. I'm a dreamer. I have so many dreams in life. And I have made all of those dreams come true. So any dream that you have can come true. This is my story. I have a genesis of the corpus callosum. I was born without the centerpiece of my brain, the piece that connects the left and right hemisphere. You can see here this white picture with like a weird edging to it. That is the corpus callosum. That is entirely not in my brain. I have a delayed reaction time, low muscle tone, slow learning development. I have something called motor overflow. I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna put the mic down and see if this will work. So I'm gonna show you something really interesting with my hands. And I want both of you to put, or all of you to put your both hands up like this together. And I am only going to be moving one hand, my right hand. And when I do that, look at your right hand and your left hand. So, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so right now I am only moving my right hand. My left hand is not moving at all, but due to my brain disorder, it mimics. And the doctors are like, why are you doing that? With the like knee reflex things that the doctors do, they will hit my like right knee, and it's either my left knee and my leg will pop, or both. Never the one they hit. And they're like, is he just playing with us or something? Why is he doing that? But it was not under my control at all. And with the Rubik's Cube and that hand thing, that is one reason I contribute to why I average 30 seconds. But I don't let that define me. I'm like, okay, I can get faster. I just gotta really, really work at it and figure out different techniques. I'm at a threshold of skill and intuition, and I always, in my eyes, mess up. But my way of messing up is only I choose to take extra turns for one F12 step. But I gotta fix my mind into, okay, I gotta slow down, figure out the faster moves to speed up. I'm stuck, but am I actually stuck? No. So with like a traffic jam and the bridge is out, that is like information. You have the corpus callosum in your brain that relays the information from each hemisphere. Since I don't have that, I have like a traffic jam where the information says cars. And what happens if the bridge collapses? You have to backtrack and find a new bridge. It takes me extra time for me to do things. But when I'm slower, that just gets me to see life in a different view. So I may be slower, but I'm actually as fast as you. I just am in slow motion. And I do not have autism, but I have an alike to it. Having ACC and autism are not on the same spectrum, but are parallel. So like Max Park, I am a lot like him in the mental ways, in other words, but we love to thrive. I know he is a great role model, and I'm grateful to understand him in life. And I know that Max Park is kind of nonverbal, so I like being a voice for those with disabilities. And motivation. I love to just share my story. For being a brand ambassador, I specialize in education and motivation with my brain disorders and story. I want to help others, and by helping others, helps myself. I want to be a teacher. I want to be an advocate. I want to be an educator, and just help others. And all my students, I have taught someone as young as 7 years old. I have taught someone, my grandpa, who this summer will be 90 years old, and he solves the Rubik's Cube once a day. I have taught him. And that tells me, if someone's 7 years old, I with a disability, my grandpa, a 90-year-old who can solve a Rubik's Cube, anybody in the entire world has the truest ability to solve one, guaranteed. It's just like saying LOL, BRB, ILYSM. If you understand that, just by texting, it's the same thing with like RU, R prime, U prime, and all that. And that's what I use to teach others. And when I teach others, I use their interests, whether it be like gymnastics, football, soccer, cheerleading, golf, whatever their interests are, I will talk with them and incorporate the cube into their life, and they can do it. It's amazing to see the brain click, like, oh, I get it now. And that is the best feeling in the world for a teacher. And my quote that I've always lived by is that cognitive distortions and distractions in our lives produce limitations, creating obstacles to mask our reality of our conquerable strengths, abilities, and our potential. So don't let your mindset inhibit you. Let your mindset grow. Don't put I can't in your vocabulary. That will just hurt more. But just grow. Everybody has the ability to grow. And with my advocating that I've learned in life, the answer is no to the questions never asked. I was like, wow, I can do this. I can grow. I don't really need my parents anymore. I have my dad here with me, but it's a vacation. And for Rubik's, I am a school presenter. These pictures here, I was recently at a school, and these kids were just like, you're like a celebrity, what? And I was like, wait, this is happening? My dream of being a speaker is coming true? And like right now, being on stage does not faze me. When I was little, I would speak at my brain disorders conference, the National Organization for the Disorders of the Corpus Callosum, and just by that, got me on stage, no fear whatsoever. And it's just great to be a representative and an ambassador for Rubik's and just share my passion and share my story to all these wonderful students. The bottom picture there is just a table of a bunch of Rubik's products, and they're like, what's this? Show me this, show me that. And I'm like, okay. So, I will answer questions in a moment. But I wanted to answer the one question, what my greatest cubing accomplishment is. And that is being a brand ambassador. I received the Rubik slide, which you can get on Amazon right now. I received it early to help them find a solution. I was amazed that no other ambassador found a solution. And having a disability, I was like, I can do this. I can set a world record being the first one to solve it. And that to me is all just like, wait, but this is a team. It was a team effort, and we worked all together, all ambassadors, to create the official solution guide. But it wasn't just me. The team really got me growing and being included. And I love being an inclusion specialist. And with Rubik's Cubes and toys, I'm like a professional kid. And I will be passing out some business cards, but right here are all my socials if you want to follow me. Any questions?
I can run the mic if anyone has a question.
Question?
How long did it take you to first solve the Rubik's Cube?
About 5 minutes, and then 2 weeks later went quickly to 3 because I understood it. And about 6 more months brought it down to like minute 45. Then years later, down to 45, and now I'm at my threshold of averaging 30 seconds. My best at home is 19. Best in competition is 23. I'm hoping for a 22 tomorrow. Any other questions?
What other events do you like solving besides 3x3?
2x2, Pyraminx, 4x4, and 5, 6, and 7. I don't compete in all those, just because I know I don't make the cutoffs, but I would do it for fun. I have done the 4x4 in competition, but just would not qualify for here. And my least favorite WCA puzzles would be the square one and the skew. Only because the notation and really figuring it out. But I still want to learn and improve. I'm never going to really say in my life, that's my worst. I just gotta improve.
Awesome. We'll do one more question, and then if you have questions after, Sam is around all weekend, but we've got one more question here.
Speaking of WCA events, do you practice one-handed? Do you find that has...
So yes, I love doing one-handed. I average like 3 minutes to 5, but the thing with my hands, if the mic were the cube, right, and I was solving it, my other hand would just float in the air as like an invisible cube. So I love being able to have fun with that characteristic. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. All right, next up we have AJ Kamal and Owen Widdis, who are coming up.
Good job, Sam. Oops. Oops. I also make a news that thing. See you, Sam. Way to go, guys. Also, I'd like the example that you did. That was awesome.
All right, we have AJ and Owen doing a seminar on the importance of FMC and how you can do it too. AJ is coming to us from New Hope, Pennsylvania this weekend. And he has a 22.67 official FMC mean, which is currently ranked 7th in the world and 3rd in North America. And Owen is coming to us from Grosse Pointe Park, Michigan. And he's been doing FMC seriously since November 2018, and since then achieved a 25.33 official mean, which is ranked 53rd in the world. And in 2019, came to Canada and won our championship as an American. So, you know. And so, yeah, we're excited to have you both, and I will hand it over to you.
Hi everyone. So I'm Owen and this is AJ, and we're going to be talking to you about the importance of FMC and how you can do it too. So for those who are unfamiliar of what FMC actually is, it is a 1-hour timed event where the competitor is given a scramble and you're allowed to try to find the shortest move solution possible. And there's a common misconception that you're only allowed to try the scramble once, but that's not true. You can solve it as many times as you'd like during the attempt. And to put it into better perspective, if you're still unclear, some people like to call FMC the standardized test of cubing because the competitors sit down in a quiet room, turn off their phones, and just write on a piece of paper for an hour. So first we're going to go over some of the beginner techniques of FMC. So definitely the most important technique that you're going to need to know is block building. A common approach is starting off with a 2x2x2 block. And for those who don't know what that is, on the right side of the screen here, we have a picture of a 2x2. And a way of solving this is by adding 2 cross pieces and putting an F12 pair between them. And then from there, usually people build 2x2x3 blocks, which is adding another cross piece and another F12 pair. And then from there, people add an F12 minus 1, which is your F12 minus 1 F12 pair. And generally people do this approach because it gets you closer to last layer, gives you better F12 cases, and you're closer to OLL, PLL, you could potentially get a last layer skip. You're closer to having a few pieces left on the cube that you could do an insertion on, which we'll talk about later. And it's very important to be creative with your block building solutions because generally people sometimes think that the shortest solution for a block solution is the best, but that's necessarily not true. Sometimes the longer solution for a block will give better continuations.
And another great thing about block building in FMC is it can really help with developing efficiency for other events, especially for me, I know in Megaminx it's really helped solve F12 pairs and S12 pairs more efficiently, so it can really help there as well.
So next we're going to be talking about edge orientation, which is also a very important part of FMC. So on a cube there are 3 axes. There's green, blue, yellow, white, and red, orange. And each of these axes has its own respective edge orientation. And so if we're talking about the green and blue axes, an edge can be oriented if it can be solved using an R, L, U, D, F2, or B2 move. So if you take a look in the bottom right, we have an example scramble here. And if you look at the green and white edge, that edge is misoriented because it needs to be solved by using an F prime. And if you look at the yellow-green edge, that edge is oriented because it can be solved using an F2 move. And edges are defined as good and bad. A good edge is when it's oriented, and a bad edge is when it's misoriented. So to solve EO, there's a bit of a process. So first, you're going to want to count how many bad edges there are on the respective axis. You can range from 2 to 12. Then from there you reduce or set up the cube to 4 bad edges left, because when you have 4 bad edges, you can solve them, you can orient them using one move. And you put those 4 bad edges on the axial face that you're solving for EO, and then you do that 1/4 turn to orient those edges. So why is EO useful? EO can be very helpful with block building. It makes just solving blocks a lot easier when your edges are oriented. And also when you're getting to F12, your edges will be oriented, so you're more likely to, you're going to get a cross case for your OLL, and it just makes your potential of getting a better skeleton or finish a lot easier, better. And EO is also the basis for a very important method called domino reduction, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And yeah. So if you have a cube on you, we have a bit of an example here to show you how EO works. So pull out a cube, and we have a scramble up there. So I'll give you all a second to do that.
Okay.
So once you have that all scrambled up, if you do the moves U2 L prime, if you look on the F face, the green side, there will be 4 bad edges there. So you can kind of see what the bad edge looks like. And then if you do an F move, that will orient all those edges, and your edge orientation will be solved. So that's just a little example there. And then if you look a little further, if you do the moves B2 U prime, R prime U2 after those EO moves, it'll solve a 2x2x2 block. So that's just a little bit of an example of how edge orientation and block building go hand in hand. So I'll give you all a second to take a look and play around with that.
So next we'll be going over some of the more intermediate techniques for FNC. So starting with insertions and commutators, you'll notice that sometimes it's a little hard to solve the cube directly. Sometimes you are able to get a little lucky with a easy last layer or last layer skip or something like that. But it's often a lot easier to reduce the cube to a point where you have a few pieces left. This can be a few corners, a few edges, or both. You can see on the screen, this is an example of a 5-corner skeleton. So something like that where most of the cube is solved, but you just have a few pieces left. And so yeah, that's what a skeleton is. And so what insertions are is taking that skeleton and inserting an algorithm or multiple algorithms into the middle of the skeleton rather than just solving it at the end. And so what you can do, and this is just an example, there's no scramble to follow along, but the goal is to insert an algorithm that cancels moves with the skeleton. So you can see in this example here, there's an 8-move algorithm that's being inserted, and the R prime, the first move of the alg, cancels out with the R in the skeleton shown in the @ symbol spot there. And so you can see that even though you're adding an 8-move alg to the skeleton, you're really only adding 6 moves to the final solution. And so basically what you can do with insertions is check each spot. You can use a method called rness for this, and I'll go over what nis is in a second, but basically you'll, for the @ symbol spot there, for example, you do all the moves after, then do the scramble, and then do all the moves leading up to the spot, and it'll show what the case for the skeleton looks like there. And so you can go through the skeleton, see which spot you can cancel the most amount of moves. And so for most common insertions, you're going to be using commutators, which are a special type of alg that use the form A, B, A prime, B prime. So there's 2 examples here you can do on your cube for corners and edges that they cycle with either 3 corners or 3 edges. You can see for the corner example, the L, D, L prime would be A, the U would be B, and then each of the moves after that, just undo those. So that's why it's A prime and B prime. And commutators are a very useful technique in other events, such as blindfolded solving. They're the foundation of the 3-style method, which is used by all top blind solvers. You'll learn about that in the next seminar a bit. But yeah, it's just another example of how FMC can be very useful for other events. And the final intermediate technique we'll be going over today is nis. And so this is definitely one of the most helpful techniques. You'll often notice in FMC that it might be hard to find a continuation to a start or just find something to do to begin with. And so what you can do here is use the inverse of the scramble. So you can undo all the moves and basically do them backwards. And you can switch between the normal and inverse scramble as many times as you want. And at the end, all you have to do is have all your moves done on the normal scramble, and then add all your moves done on the inverse scramble onto the end of those. And so this is a very useful technique when you're kind of struggling and get stuck.
So on the bottom right part of the screen, we have a pseudo block. So what exactly that is, so you can see that block looks like it's a 2x2, but it's not quite right. So if you do those moves to get that block on the normal part of the scramble, and then you switch, that block will be one move to be solved. So that is also a very helpful technique within FMC. So that's something pretty important.
And so just another quick example here, you'll see we have the normal scramble on top, the inverse on the bottom, and so the parentheses for the 2x2x2 indicate that it's done on the inverse scramble. And so if you do those 5 moves on the inverse scramble, you'll see it makes a 2x2x2. And then to show kind of how this works, if you do the opposite moves done, so basically just inverting those moves for the 2x2x2, and then do the normal scramble, you'll see that the 2x2x2 is still there, but it'll look a little different, have a different set of continuations. And so basically for each block you have, there's 2 different opportunities to continue from there. So it really increases the chances you have of finding a good solution.
So now we're going to go over some of the more advanced techniques. So out there right now, the best technique is domino reduction, which can be called DR for short. So what DR is when all the corners and edges on their respective axis are oriented. So if you look in the bottom of the screen, we have 2 pictures of a DR. And you can see that all the white and yellow corners and edges are oriented, and all of the E layer edges are also oriented. So reducing to DR makes solving the cube a lot easier. There's a bunch of different ways you can solve the cube. And it's also important to note, you cannot do an FBRL or FBR and L. Yeah. That will break DR in this case, so you don't want to do that. You can only use moves that are not those to preserve DR. So to get to DR, this bit is a little bit confusing. But first you're going to want to start with the EO, and then from there you're going to want to set up to a 3x3 trigger. So what a trigger is if you look in the bottom right, we have RUR prime on a 3x3. So what you're trying to do is set up to DR minus and RUR prime. So you can also set up to DR minus RU2R prime, which is 2 edges and 4 corners. And you can also set up to DR minus 4E4C, which is just a single turn, like an F.
So getting to DR can be difficult enough, but then after getting to DR, you have to finish the cube from there. And so a pretty common technique for this is doing edge insertions. Because of the oriented edges, it's very easy to cancel a lot of moves compared to doing corner insertions. And so a pretty common technique is to find DRs with good corners, or basically corners that can be solved in a small amount of moves, and try to avoid bad corner DRs. And so this is a very major part of time management in FMC, which is, so basically if you are spending too much time looking at bad corner DRs, it's really going to be difficult to continue your attempt, and so you want to try to spend as little time possible finding good corner DRs, and this is basically a principle that's used throughout all the other different methods for FMC. You just don't want to spend too much time on things you don't think will be worth it, and it's hard to tell what is sometimes. And so yeah, there's basically these are some 3 major ways to continue your DR solve after getting to DR. So 2 different block building approaches, either to a direct finish or to a skeleton. As I said, typically an edge skeleton, but it can really be anything. And then the third and the most advanced technique we'll be going over today is half turn reduction, or HTR. And so what this is reducing the cube to a point where it can be solved using only half turns or double moves. So things like R2, U2, and all those. And what's great about HTR is you're getting the cube to a point where it can be solved in usually less than 10 moves. or you can get it to a point where it's, you can get an easy to insert skeleton. And so basically what you're doing for HDR is you're solving DR a third time. And so again, you're setting up to one of these triggers, RU2R prime or F. And so HDR can really be useful in shortening your DR solutions.
It's also important to note that there's a thing called fake HDR where the corners are not exactly permuted correctly. So it will not be as easy to find the finish off of this. So you gotta be careful when you're doing HDR that you're not getting an HDR that's not really HDR. So why is FMC so important?
So many cubers see FMC as very difficult, very time consuming. It's not held at a lot of competitions, so a lot of people aren't really sure why it's worth to practice the event. But we are trying to argue that it's really a unique event. There's nothing else like it, and it's very helpful in improving efficiency and time management in other events. And so it really can, not only that, but really gain a better understanding of how the cube works. When you're doing insertions, when you're doing EO, when you're doing block building, and when you're really spending an hour looking at a cube rather than just solving it as quickly as possible, you really start to understand what certain moves, what certain algorithms, what they do to a cube. And I think for Owen and I, definitely it's helped us kind of see the cube in a different light, and that's why FMC is such a great and unique event.
So if you want to dive a little deeper into FMC, we have a few resources here that go more in deep on what we've talked about today. So hands down, the best resource out there is the Fewest Moves Facebook group. In this group, people post their solves, they ask questions, there's a weekly competition that goes on in there, and the best way to improve at FMC is to look at other people's solutions for a scramble that you've done. Because by doing this, you are seeing what you possibly missed and what things you can do differently. And I know for me personally, that is where I've seen the most improvement, is by just seeing what other people have done on an attempt. There's also a few YouTube tutorials out there. JPerm and SpeedCube Review have some great videos about some of the topics we talked about today. So if you want to check those out, they're out there. And you can also come up to us, ask us any questions. We are on social media, on YouTube and Instagram. And you can also just come up to us after this seminar if you have a few questions. And you can ask a few questions after we're done here. Any questions?
Sorry, what was the question? Okay, we'll do 3 questions. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, cool.
This was just like a random thought that I had during the presentation, but have you done FNC solutions on like world record solves or something? Just a random thought. Like, have you ever, I just, like, in the time, like, just a random thought.
So like, are you asking like, have we tried some of the past scrambles of like world records and stuff?
Yeah, like that.
Yeah, there was a scramble, the current world record, a few of us, were you at that competition? Oh, okay. Well, I know a few of my friends have, I tried the scramble, but at the FMC Earth 2019 competition, there was the world record scramble, and we've tried that scramble out and understand the solution. And we've also looked at, not necessarily world record scrambles, but we've also gone back at old competitions and tried some of the scrambles just to see and compare ourselves to other solutions and stuff. So yeah.
So, what was the count, the solution?
The world record right now is 16, so 16 moves.
Okay. Hi, Owen. Okay. So, probably other people agree with me on this, but one of the worst cases I've come across when it comes to doing FMC is when you have a 2-corner, 2-edge swap. What is the best way to avoid that? Or if you can't avoid it, how do you deal with it?
Yeah, so for 2 edges and 2 corners, it can be pretty difficult to, you can do insertions is typically what I would do if I can get to it in a small amount of moves, but it's definitely easy to avoid stuff like that if you're able to manage your time well and just look at a lot of different continuations, a lot of different starts. There's a lot of stuff, like you said, cases people complain about, and even though they can be annoying, if you're looking at enough, if you're managing your time well enough, you can avoid anything. But for 2E2C specifically, you could try to insert like a J-perm or something like that.
Yeah, and along with that, there's a lot of variations of J-perm and also T-perm called cyclic shifts. This is just a different technique that you can go into a little more, but it's also very helpful for inserting 2E, 2C. So.
Hi, so for FMC, you're allowed to bring 3 cubes in, and I want to know what your thoughts are on like the best way to utilize 3 cubes, because I feel like half the time I just end up with 1 cube I use a lot and 2 scramble cubes, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And personally, I kind of struggle with this as well in my attempts. I don't know if AJ can relate to this, but one thing that I sometimes do is if I am looking at like, say, an HDR, I'll scramble it on the normal, and then I'll also put it on the inverse to see if there's a different continuation I can look at. And this kind of technique applies to other parts of FMC solving, such as like EO and other ways of doing that. I don't know if AJ wants to say anything else on that.
Yeah, that's a pretty good strategy, actually. Don't do that. Maybe I'll do that tomorrow. But I usually just use 1 cube for most of the time. I guess if you're getting towards the end of your attempt and you're mess up solving your cube, I know I did that this morning, and you want to switch to the other one, you're running out of time. But yeah, what Owen said is, if you want to compare 2 of the similar case on the normal and inverse scramble, that can be very helpful.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Owen and AJ. And like I said, I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, so if you have a question, feel free to go up to them afterwards and ask them directly. All right, next up, we have Tommy, Cherry, Elliot, Kobelansky, and Noah Swor doing a seminar on the future of 3x3 Blindfolded, new theory, and recent advancements. I'm just going to give them a minute to get situated here.
Go box members! Sorry. Sorry, Elliot.
All right, so Tommy Cherry is coming to us from Lake Worth, Florida. He is a 5-time world record holder, including 4 records in 3x3 blindfolded. The first sub-18, sub-17, and sub-16 official mean all at once, and the first official sub-15 single, and one of the first people to fully learn an algorithm set called LTCT, which we'll be talking about today. Elliot Kobelansky comes to us from Montreal, Quebec. He is second in the world for 3-blind single and mean, Canadian record holder for 3-blind single and mean, and the second person to break the sub-15 barrier. And rounding out the top 3 in the world, we have Noah Swor from Palm Harbor, Florida. And as I said, he is 3rd in the world currently for 3x3 blindfolded single. And with that, I'll hand it over.
Test. Okay, hi. How does this work? Okay. Okay, hi everybody, welcome. We'll be talking about the future of 3x3 blindfolded, new theory, and recent advancements. So today, first, we'll be giving a brief 3-blind rundown for some of you who maybe don't know too much about the event, how it works and stuff. So hopefully, by hearing that, you may be able to understand some more of the advanced stuff, and even if you don't understand all of it, you may be able to latch on to a couple of key points. And so those advanced techniques are pseudo-swapping, floating, and LTCT, which you may have heard of, but we'll be going into depth and covering maybe some more advanced stuff you don't know about. So first of all, blindfolded solving, how does it differ from regular 3x3 solving? My best way to explain this is that you essentially have to one look every single solve. Except you don't use a regular speed solving method like CFOP or RU, because those methods involve you looking at the cube after different steps. So instead, we use a different method where we solve corners and edges separately, and we solve a couple pieces at a time without affecting others. And so if we go a bit more in depth on the process, for each corners and edges, we're going to start at a piece called a buffer. And you're going to hear this term a lot in the presentation, so it's important you know what it is. And so a buffer is a piece at which we start tracing. And what tracing is we start at a piece and we see where it has to go. And then we see where that piece has to go and where that piece has to go. And we go around the cube like that. So the easiest example for this is, I would say, the U-perm on the screen, where you can pick any of the three pieces as your buffer and look where it has to go. And then let's say we start at the piece that's up front, it has to go to the left, and then that piece has to go to the right, and then we return back to our original piece, and that would complete the tracing. And so we do this for both corners and edges. And then what we have to do is remember all the pieces we shot to. And there are methods for doing this that I won't get in, but it may seem like a daunting task, but with a couple tricks, it actually becomes quite easy. So once we remember those, we put on the blindfold, and we just solve those in order, one or two at a time, without affecting the rest of the pieces. And so let's look at Tommy's world record single, and since he's here, I'll let him explain it.
All right, hello. Before I explain the example, one thing we need to mention is that there's a QR code in the bottom right hand of the screen. Some of you might have noticed that. Pretty much you can just scan it at any point to come back to this presentation later, in case you want to take a look at some of the examples in more detail and get a better understanding of them. So yeah, here's the current world record single, 14.61. There's a bit of a formatting issue. Those question marks should be arrows, but pretty much the scramble of the world record is the top left cube, and going from one cube to the next, each time I did an algorithm. So using the process Elliot explained, I would solve a few pieces at a time, and you can see the cube kind of slowly coming together. I memorized certain letters based on where the pieces had to go. With those letters, I made words, and depending on what words I had memorized, I performed certain algorithms that would eventually lead to the cube at the bottom of the screen, which is the solved cube, of course.
All right, so there are quite a few algorithms we use in high-level three-point solving, and I'll be going over each of them. So starting up is 3 cycles. These cycle either 3 corners or 3 edges, or both, using a technique called block combs, but we're not going to be talking about those today. While you may have heard that it may be a lot of algorithms to learn how to do every single 3 cycle possible from just a single buffer, all of the algorithms are very intuitive, and you can figure all of them out just on any of the cubes you might be solving on right now. And these make up a vast majority of the algorithms we use in a given 3-line solve. Parity algorithms swap 2 corners and 2 edges, like AJ and Owen were talking about, and parity comes up in about every other solve. And then we also use twists and flips, which cycle a piece in place, and as given in the picture right there. And 2E2Es and 2C2Cs, these stand for 2 edges, and 2 corners, 2 corners. For example, a Z-perm on a 3x3 is a 2E2E because it swaps 2 different adjacent edges. And then miscellaneous parity stuff, which we'll be having Elliot explain. Tommy, my bad.
Okay, well, I'm explaining this, but the miscellaneous parity stuff was referring to stuff later on.
We'll get to that.
So how we define parity in 3x3 blindfolded is a bit different to something like OLL parity on 4x4. And how we define it is when we trace and we have an odd number of targets. And if we trace in the most simple way, we will always have, if we have an odd target in edges, we will always also have an odd target in corners because of how the cube works. And this is a bit annoying because normally if we have an even amount of targets, we can split them up into pairs and solve each one of them with 3 cycles. That may be a bit confusing because three cycles imply 3 pieces, but we're solving 2 at a time, but just stick with me. And then we have this parity target, which is annoying because we can't solve it with a normal 3 cycle. So what we have to do is combine our corner buffer with the corner target, the last corner target, the edge buffer with the last edge target, and combine it into one algorithm that will swap those pieces. The only issue with this, though, is that for any given last corner target and last edge target, there's 462 algorithms. A lot of them aren't great and aren't optimized. I know there's an effort to optimize them, but they're really hard to learn, especially when you're first starting out. And then this blows up when you want to start learning about floating buffers, which we'll talk about, which goes to 11,000 ALEX, which isn't the easiest thing to do. And so how we solve this is we use something called pseudo-swapping. And what pseudo-swapping does is that we always fix that last edge target to be the same thing. And what this does is that it reduces 21 times 22 into 21 times 1, which is quite a big reduction. And then for the equivalent for the floating stuff I talked about, it's something like 80 algorithms. And all these algorithms are really good. So how do we actually force this? What we're going to do is solve two edges into each other's places. And what this does, it always assures the last edge target when done properly. And this is sort of common practice among people who use three-style and top blinders. The advantage of this, very low ALEX count, as you saw, 21 for fixed buffers. Many fast ALEX, such as setups to PLLs, and also a lot of them are setups to each other. And also pseudo-swapping is very easy to do. It almost becomes automatic once you get to a top level. And then another thing is that if we always force this last target to be the same, we don't have to actually memorize it. Yeah, and that's good. And the only disadvantage is that sometimes it'll add an alg over full parity, which is that algorithm set of 462. But it's quite a good trade-off. And so we can take this a bit further. And this is, we're going a bit more into the advanced stuff now. So why should we always limit ourselves to one swap? I mean, it does force 21 algorithms, but if we use a couple other swaps, we don't have to learn 462, but we can learn a bit more, and I'll show why that's good. So, for example, for a given corner swap, we can learn a bunch of algorithms that use different edge swaps. And what this does is it leads to a lot more options and opportunities. For example, better algorithms. If we use this notation is a bit complicated, I won't get into it, but normally we would do U to lefty J-perm, but if we use an alternate pseudo-swap, it can become U to righty J-perm. And since I'm right-handed, that's a lot easier for me. And that's an example of better ALEX. Another thing it can do is it can save an algorithm in solves. So if something is already solved in place or pseudo-solved in place, we can use an algorithm that won't affect those pieces. And that's good because we won't have to apply another algorithm to the cube. And as you see, as you may be able to see throughout the seminar, saving an algorithm is quite key because it can reduce up to 10% of the solve. Actually more, but. And then we could take this even one step further using something called dynamic alternate pseudo-swapping. And this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but it's quite an involved process that I have in my head right now that I haven't started documenting, but I still wanted to mention it. And essentially what it is, it's deciding on the swap you do during tracing based on what you're solving. So what I explained earlier is you decide on the swap before you trace edges, but instead here you're doing it as you're tracing edges. And what this is good for is that it'll occasionally save an alg over normal alternate pseudo-swapping. That may have been a lot, but I will pass it over to Noah, who will talk about floating.
Okay, so I'm sure you guys have heard of this term before, and hopefully I can explain it, because I also didn't know what it was at first. So what it is using multiple edges and corner buffers. So what we normally do is just learn all of 3 cycles from one specific buffer, but what can be better for a lot of scrambles is knowing how to do 3 cycles from any given buffer. So if we look at the example scramble on the screen, normally you could be tracing from, say, like one of the buffers on the top layer, and you see how that's just a U-perm to solve the top. But once we do that U-perm, the top layer is solved, and our buffer we used is solved. So normally what we would do is choose a random unsolved piece to break into and continue doing cycles. But what that would do is cause us to add 2 extra algs to the solve. And what we can do instead is notice how on the front layer there's just 1 U-perm left. Why don't we just do the 1 U-perm to finish the solve? And that's essentially what floating is. And while it may seem ridiculous to have to relearn every 3 cycle from every single buffer possible on the cube, every time you learn an additional buffer, the next set gets smaller because you don't have to cycle to one that you already know. And just once you know how to learn 3 cycles, they become a lot easier for your brain to process. This is, while floating is normally done when your buffer is solved, you can also do it when your buffer is flipped. So, for example, if you see another piece on the cube flipped, and you get to a point in your memory where your buffer is flipped, you can just start floating, and then when you start execution, just do the 2-flip algorithm that involves your main buffer, and then you can do the rest of the solve from a different buffer. Although, you can also do it when you only have the 1 piece flip, that being your buffer. So, for example, if I can get the cube mic here. Technology. Okay, so this might be a little bit hard to see here. Yeah. Okay. So if we start tracing from here, like normal, we'd go here, then here. This is the flipped piece because we're going here instead of here. So, but what we notice is that we still have these 3 edges left unsolved. So if I grab a different cube, that's the same as having this case right here. And this is very fast. It's just 5 moves to solve it. So what we can do is just do the 5-move algorithm and then continue the rest of the solve like normal. And go back to the presentation. And while this may seem complicated, it can be a useful technique because then you're forcing faster output in solves. So for example there, we did a 5-move algorithm instead of what would normally have been an 8-move algorithm. It also means that we can use more visual memo in the solve because you just notice that one algorithm and you just see, okay, I just have to do that algorithm instead of assigning letters to it. And you can get more pieces out of the way earlier in the solve. This is just kind of a table that details how to do that. So like in all the different options that you get. Additionally, you usually float when you reach your solved buffer on the second target, but you can also do it once you have it on the first letter pair. So obviously we use letter pairs to cycle pieces, but you can also do it when you reach the buffer on your first letter as opposed to your second, which is what people normally do. And this involves basically whenever you reach your buffer while memorizing, you just float anyways, and then solve the cube with something like a 2E, 2E, or 2C, 2C at the end of the solve. And this makes it so that you never miss a float. Something that happens to all of us sometimes is that you'll miss an easy float and then it'll be like, oh my god, this solve could have been 9 hours instead of 10 hours. It could have been like a second faster. But this can prevent that from happening. And then I'll be giving this time.
All right, so yeah, we have another example on the screen here. First of all, we have edges, X, quarters, Y. X and Y are just the letters representing the buffers, or just the pieces we trace from. We have an even number of edge targets because we can guarantee that with the pseudo-swapping technique that Elliot talked about. Yeah, because we don't memorize the last edge, so even when there's parity, which would normally involve an odd number of targets, we're still doing an odd number of targets, but since we know what the last one is, we don't have to include that in our memorization. There's an odd number of corner targets because when there's parity, that just has to happen unless we pseudo-swap corners, but that's a completely separate thing, and it's usually not very good for solves. So the letter G up here is just a placeholder for any letter we would memorize for when we have a parity algorithm to do. And in this example, there's also a twisted corner somewhere on the cube. And most approaches people would take to this involves using 2 algorithms to solve the parity target and then the twisted corner. You could simply do a parity algorithm and then a two-twist algorithm, which twists your buffer one way and the other twists your corner the other way. And there's also a way to do a commutator that sets up to a parity algorithm, three-cycle rather. Commutator is just another word for three-cycle pretty much. And there's a solution to doing this in two algorithms. You can do it in one algorithm with an algorithm set called LTCT, which stands for last target corner twist. So yeah, like I kind of explained, it does that all in one algorithm. You have to learn 252 algorithms in total, which might sound like a lot, but in reality, a lot of the algorithms are very, very similar to each other because they're just a single move away from each other, like a D or a D prime. So in reality, it's more like learning about 100 algorithms. We have an example here on the screen. This is actually the one Jack Kai used in his 16.22 former world record single. Shout out to Jack in the audience. Yeah, so that was kind of one of the first examples of LTCT being introduced to a wide number of people. And this is a technique that shows up in a lot of solves. So about 15 to 20% of the time. And a few years back, people would pretty much just use this set of algorithms for a select few cases because it was kind of just seen as a trick you could use every once in a while. But now there are actually multiple people that know all the algorithms, myself included, and I know Elliot's getting pretty close. Yeah, so it's becoming much more useful. Since we can use this every few solves, we can reduce our solve by an entire algorithm. And like Noah was kind of saying before, reducing your solve by about 10% makes a huge difference at the high level. And there are some extensions to this technique. So one of them is floating LTCT. So instead of confining yourself to a single buffer, just like with floating, you do it from other buffers. You can do setup moves or rotations to solve algorithms like this from other buffers. There's also the idea of learning dedicated algorithms to each buffer. Problem is, this isn't quite the same as learning 3 cycles from a bunch of different buffers, because with 3 cycles you can intuitively understand them. While with this, it's more memorization based, and that might be something people get to in the future, but since it's a lot of algorithms to learn, it takes a lot of time, and it's not necessarily the best way to be improving yet. There's also this thing called LTEF, which stands for last target plus edge flip. It's essentially the same thing as LTCT, but instead of a twisted corner, we have a flipped edge. And of course, we also do parity while solving that flipped edge. 231 algorithms, so similar to LTCT. People don't actually really use this in solves yet, but it's something that the three of us can definitely see being viable in the near future. We just haven't really gotten around to finding and learning all the algorithms. So, and of course, there's an example on the screen for this as well. And this other thing called T2C. It stands for two twisted corners. There are a few ways. Sorry, my bad. Two corners. There are a few ways you can think about this. You have two swapped corners somewhere on the cube, and the twisted corner is your buffer. So it's similar to LTCT, where it's parity plus a twist, but instead of the twisted corner being anywhere on the cube, it's your buffer specifically. So you have to recognize this a little bit differently from LTCT, because you could also think about this like doing LTCT from a different buffer, but because of the way we memorize and trace where the pieces have to go, that's not really something reasonable to notice. So that's why we have to learn separate algorithms for it. And there are only 126 algs for these. I know a select few people use a few of these algorithms, but this is another thing where we can see it being implemented very soon, and we kind of just haven't gotten around to. So yeah, the example. Oh yeah, that too. It's only like 50 algorithms because similar to LTCT, where a lot of the algorithms are a single move away from each other, so you kind of learn them in groups rather than learning them individually, and you can see how they're all associated with each other. Oh yeah, how do I go back? Elliot just wanted me to also mention that it's also a very, very common thing in addition to LTCT. So being able to use all these together will definitely allow blind solvers to use tricks more consistently and effectively. And we compiled pretty much a list of other techniques that we wanted to talk about that we didn't quite have the time for today. You can look at these on the QR code, because we're not really going to spend time on these. We just kind of have a summary here of what we went over. And if you have any questions about anything from the list after looking, you can feel free to ask. But yeah, with that, we're going to head right into the question and answer session. So let's see. I'll take you right there. Oh, sorry.
Right. We'll go here.
So I've also heard of weak swapping as far as fixing parity, mainly in the context of multi. So I guess what's the difference between that and pseudo swap?
So the thing with weak swap that we do for multi-blind is it's useful for when you trace edges first, and we don't know when we pick up a cube if it has parity or not. And so we have to use weak swap. And what weak swap does is that it can guarantee the same amount of algorithms as pseudo swapping. Thing is, in 3-blind, we trace corners first, so we know when there's parity. And weak swap is not really useful because it limits you to certain algorithms in certain cases. And since we know there's parity, we can just pseudo swap and force some better algorithms instead of using weak swap. Yeah. I'm sorry if that's a vague answer. I try my best.
All right, I'm gonna go back here.
Where would you recommend starting for someone who's interested in learning how to blind solve?
So I learned from a YouTube tutorial by somebody by the name of Bad Mephisto, so you can look that up on YouTube, and I found the tutorial very, very helpful. There's also a tutorial by Noah Arthurs, although that's a bit longer. It's multiple parts, so not necessarily quite as easy to learn from. Also, Jack from the audience, once again, he has a tutorial. So you can just look up Jack High, how to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded, and those are all definitely great places to start.
All right, here.
Hi, so when you said in the floating buffer slide that you had lighter memo, what does that mean?
Okay, so one technique that we use all the time in top level 3 blinding is visualizing your memo. So let's say you have 2 random pieces flipped on a cube. You don't really want to have to assign letters to that because it's much easier to just have a picture in your brain and make that really quickly to try to remember where pieces are, then make the letter pairs, remember those, recall those during the solve. And what you want to do is try to maximize visualizing the cube as much as possible because using letter pairs is slower, but obviously the safer option.
Yeah, just the reason making letter pairs is slower is because you have to spend time, once you see the colors, thinking about, okay, what letter is this, and then make a word out of it because you convert the letters into pairs, and then do an algorithm based on that, as opposed to just seeing the colors and knowing what algorithm to do instantly.
All right, we're gonna do 2 more questions, these 2 up here. All right, 1 and 2.
Hi again. So, all these tips are great, I will say, they're all great. However, with someone who averages like 55 memo, this would bring my average from like 130 to 1 minute. So how do I improve the memo part of my solve?
So at that point, it's mostly just practice, and I know that's very vague. However, practice is more than just doing solves. You always have to be actively finding ways to improve, always actively criticizing yourself, seeing, okay, what was bad about the solve, what could I have improved? Another thing with memorization specifically is, especially when you're like around the 50-second range, you never want to feel comfortable. In comp you want to, but at home you always want to be pushing yourself. Cut out reviews if you're reviewing. Trace faster to the point where like maybe you're not able to come up with letter pairs fast enough. That's a good thing. No pain, no gain.
Another thing I wanted to add is, I know the main thing that helped me, and this is kind of ridiculous, but learning 3-style itself helped my memo a ton because think about it, like when you're not using 3-style, which I know you don't, Brayden, you're splitting each individual letter pair into 2 different algorithms to remember. When you learn 3-style, you just have the 1 letter pair and 1 algorithm associated with each. And then also, you're making your execution time a lot shorter. So you have to hold on to that for a lot less time, so you can just go faster and faster, and then you have more time to remember that.
One more thing One more thing I wanted to say is that you should try to have a very structured way you review your memorization. So what a lot of beginners tend to do is memorize, say, a letter or two, and then review those, memorize the next letter or two, review everything they've done, basically repeat this process, but you like keep going back to the start, and it's very inefficient. So what I would probably recommend is, let's say, go through, depending on which piece you memo. Of course, I personally, sorry, I'll start over that sentence. Depending on which piece you memo first, which I would recommend corners. Basically, you can go through all the pieces of that type, and then review those. Move on to the next type of piece, review all of those, and then you can pretty much review the whole cube, let's say 2 or 3 times maybe, depending on how much you're comfortable with. And pretty much you're going to try to cut down on that over time. Eventually you want to get to this thing called one passing, where you pretty much just go through all of your memorization. You don't need any review. Once you've seen everything, you just nod the put the blindfold down, and then you just start executing your algorithms.
All right, last question. You've been holding your hand up for a long time.
So I'm pretty sure I should know this already, but do most blind solvers start with the edges or the corners?
We start by memorizing corners, then memorizing edges, then executing edges, then executing corners.
Can I say one more thing? And what's good about that is that by memorizing edges right before doing them, you can keep stuff really short term.
Awesome, thanks guys. Again, I know we didn't get to all your questions. I'm sorry about that. They are around, so you can ask them your questions anytime. Just gonna get my notes here for the last seminar. Thank you, Tommy, Noah, and Elliot. It's one thing to be world-class at something, another thing to be able to explain it to a bunch of people. So, good job, guys. All right, our final seminar of the evening is coming to us from Aiden Bartlett. And he is talking to us about how to remember what it feels like to improve. Aiden is coming to us from Bonnie Lake, Washington, near Seattle. And he is a 4-time North American record holder in Square One and was the 2019 Square One World Champion. And I'll give him a second to come up here.
All right, can we have everyone in the room who is named Mike please stand up? All right, that concludes the mic check. Thank you. I'm sitting down because if it looks like I'm reading off a script, I definitely am. All right. A couple months ago, I was ready to give up. I understand that's a very melodramatic way to begin a seminar about solving Rubik's Cubes, but I unfortunately could not come up with a different hook for this. I've been cubing for about 7 years now, and it's starting to feel like I was past my prime at only 18 years old. Practicing began to feel more and more like a chore whenever it was that I could get myself to even practice, and the results I was seeing in competition were not anywhere close to where I'd wanted to be at years ago. I think that my lull in cubing was very easy to chalk up to COVID and the lack of competitions for motivation, and this was of course part of it, but possibly more damaging was my unhealthy mindset and practice regimen. Over my 7 years of cubing, I've spent almost 3/4 of it exclusively practicing Square One. Ever since mid to late 2017, I almost completely dropped any other events I was doing to focus all of my energy on Square One. Square One was, and still is for most people, a very easy event to improve at. If you're blessed with naturally good turning and an intuitive sense at how to apply that turning into solves, you will see results very, very quickly. This was exactly my situation, and my 13-year-old self saw this as an opportunity to start farming podiums. I loved the feeling of improvement. There was almost nothing more satisfying to myself than looking at my own WCA profile and seeing the dramatic drop in times that I had in the event over the course of that first year of dedicated practice. I'm sure some of you can already see how this is going to end up, but bear with my story for a bit longer. The following year, I became the first North American to be ahead of Brandon Lin, who is still here tonight, maybe? I don't know. Now, I became the first North American to be ahead of Brandon Lin, who's one of the greatest square one solvers of all time, in over 3 years after netting an 8.17 North American record average in the event. I was over the moon. I cannot recall a time I was more excited for anything, ever. And my mom actually had to have me take a walk with her to calm down after that, because I was just that stoked. I held that record for all of 8 days. That was rough. I beat a record that stood for over 2.5 years, and it got whisked away from me in barely over a week. And here's where I now say that my mindset became a bit twisted. Competing and practicing was no longer about improving my own results. Rather, it was about getting ahead of someone. I was drunk off the feeling of having a record, and I wanted to become intoxicated off that feeling once more. I went on to break the North American record 3 more times over the course of the next 1.5 years. I improved my world ranking from somewhere to around 15th to 3rd in the world, and I even managed to win the World Championships for Square One in 2019. Not a bad track record, but I was never able to completely satisfy the itch that I got from my first NAR. I was now chasing that dragon, and the only way I thought I could do it was if I managed to get a world record average. An unfortunate +2 at the end of my last NAR average to date cost me an average that would have placed me 2nd in the world, which would have gotten me one step closer to my ultimate goal. Sure, 3rd place is nothing to sneeze at, and I'm incredibly lucky to be able to even say that's where I peaked, but I was crushed nonetheless. The thought of only having to climb up 1 more rank to reach my goal made everything much more tangible, but I carelessly let that slip. The average I ended up getting was 0.01 better than my previous record, and it served as a cool reminder of what I was capable of. I used that as motivation, and the attention I got from others who also believed I was capable of the world record felt really nice, admittedly. Unfortunately, as I was beginning to completely refine my turning and solving style, every competition in the world got canceled. At the time, we didn't know how long this would go on, so I was actually kind of stoked. Getting to be at home all the time meant that I could practice pretty much nonstop, and I figured that this might have been just what I needed to hopefully do something great when the time would come for me to compete again. I started live streaming most of, if not all of my practice sessions to www.twitch.tv/Aiden_Bartlett, where I was putting up some really, really good times. Day after day, I was getting averages of 12 that were routinely below what the current world record average of 5 was at the time, and I was getting averages of 5 that were more than a second faster. It became apparent to a lot of people, myself included, that I was probably the fastest square one solver in the world for a short period of time. Some of you probably just checked out as I said that and immediately started thinking to yourself how cocky I sounded there, and that was not without reason. I was cocky. As humble as I tried to sound to others, at the time I genuinely believed that I was the fastest in the world. And what 15-year-old wouldn't if the people who watched his dumb Rubik's Cube Twitch streams were echoing the same thought? I was no longer practicing to improve, but rather to stay at a good enough speed so that I would be able to stay at that self-proclaimed spot by the time I got to compete again. After like 4 to 5 months of not competing, the thrill of maintaining this position wore off. And I started to go some days without practicing for the first time in forever. It eventually just stopped altogether. That's the end of that very long-winded way of saying I plateaued and then cubing would stop being fun. I'm now going to start diagnosing what I think went wrong with my own practice, as well as how I got out of what was probably a 2-year slump. I'll try and offer some advice as well to hopefully help you all prevent this situation and what you can do if you find yourself in it. As a disclaimer, all information that I will be sharing is anecdotal, and this is just what worked or didn't work for me. Some things may be motivating to you that aren't to others, but I believe that my situation may feel very similar to a lot of top cubers who have ended up quitting in the past. So I believe that the advice I provide should be of some help to almost all of you. Let's start by taking a look at what went wrong with my own routine. The first and most obvious thing is that I was not practicing to improve my own results. However, much of the time, I was practicing to break records. Any top cuber can probably tell you how much more pressure they feel to do well when they're at a level where they expect themselves to be able to break records. For me, months before I got my first North American record, I already believed that I was more than capable of it, and that put a lot of unnecessary pressure on myself both when practicing and competing. It obviously added to comp nerves, but more importantly, it gave me a number to beat when practicing that was entirely made in my head. Every session I did was to test if I could consistently get averages below 8.45 seconds, which was the North American record at the time. Not to see if I can improve the total session as it was compared to the day or week before. Tangible goals are a good thing, but it's unhealthy to compare yourself to that goal and consider anything that doesn't meet it a failed attempt. Just because you think you are capable of a certain result does not mean you are bound to get it off of that thought alone. The second thing I was doing that was wrong was both expecting and accepting a plateau in my improvement. I stopped caring as to whether or not I would see any gradual decrease in my times as long as they were staying below a fixed marker I had previously set for myself. At my peak, that was probably around 6.6 or 6.7 seconds on square one, and as long as I can consistently put up averages below that time, I was happy. The big issue with this is that it forced me into a state of not looking for areas in which I could improve at. There were still cases I'd get, especially in the PBL step of the cube, where I wouldn't know a very efficient way to solve it and would just hope that my fast run would be enough to carry me through the rest of the solve without losing too much time. It would not have been difficult to sit down, assess which cases I had the most trouble with, and play around until I found a solution that I could execute quickly without needing to think too much, while at the same time being much more efficient. At the very least, this would have reduced the amount of bad solves I got, simply due to bad cases. This is an especially important thing for square one solvers to work on, considering the final step of the most popular advanced method has just shy of 1,000 separate cases. But the same logic can be very easily applied to any other event. 3x3 F2L, for example, is a stage that even a lot of fast cubers claim to struggle with, and have cases that they hate. There is fortunately a lot of flexibility to this step, and taking a case from a different approach may make it for a much more comfortable solution that can drastically reduce bad times due to unlucky cases. Finally, this is probably the most relatable thing for cubers of all skills. I put all of my eggs into one basket. All of my time practicing was with square one. I hardly diversified because of any time that I tried practicing another event, I either grew quickly frustrated that I wasn't as good as I'd once been before, or it was just boring to do an event that I didn't think I was any good at. At times, there were events that I would see fast people do and think, wow, that looks really fun. When I would try them out myself, I was so far removed from the idea of being mediocre at an event that I would stop after a few solves. It was as if I was upset that I didn't sponge up all the skill that solver had after watching one YouTube video. This led to a very annoying sequence of trying an event, deeming myself too hopeless to really give it a chance, and then just going back to square one solves. Evidently, the biggest issue with this way of practicing is that it is boring. Day after day, I would practice the same event without even hoping to improve because I'd resigned myself to that speed I'd achieved, even though I knew that there was more I could work on. If that sounds really boring to you, that's because it was. Obviously, I almost quit. There was absolutely no heart left in my practice, so I just started playing Minecraft a lot instead. So now you know what I think went wrong, but I obviously wouldn't be telling you all this if there wasn't something that snapped me back into my love for cubing. And what that random spark was that I had at my last competition, Schools Out PLU 2022. At this competition, I got my, at the time, overall PB 4x4 single, which was a 30.69. This was remarkably close in my eyes to the 30-second barrier I had wanted to someday cross 5 years ago. So I made a bet with myself. After this competition, I'll practice 4x4 a bit, get a sub 30 single, then call it a day. I figured I'd accomplish one goal I had a long time ago as a way to end on a high note and then just stop. It took me 4 or 5 days to accomplish this goal, but I was well aware before that point that I was absolutely not going to end up quitting. Somewhere along the line, I started having fun with cubing again. It was almost the same feeling I had when I was 13 and discovered that I had some potential in this weird square one event. Did I mention that I made an event square one? What changed though? Why did this hobby that was starting to feel so monotonous and chore-like suddenly become something that I was only the only thing I was thinking about again? And I think the answer to that is simple, and it's that I was starting to improve again. In my quest to get a sub 34x4 single, I started working on the flaws I was able to quickly identify in my solving. I managed to get my turning more consistent on this unfamiliarly sized cube to me, and I finally remembered what it felt like to improve. In doing so, I was able to rekindle my passion for other events as well, and it made much more apparent to me what my flaws and bad habits I needed to work on were. Now, suppose you didn't heed any of my warnings, or you were already feeling the same way that I've just described beforehand. I have some tips that I think may help you. And the first is to obviously diversify your events. I don't think I need to get into it too much more since I already talked about this a while ago, but I promise you that it will help. Even if you have the same struggle as I did, where you have trouble practicing events, even if you don't think you have any talent in them, push through this. You will see some improvement, and that will, I assume, feel good on a pretty deeply rooted psychological level. The second is to be honest with yourself. Something I found during this is that I would frequently lie to myself about how I would be able to quickly get back to where I used to be with just a week or two of practice. As I started attending competitions again, I quickly found out that this was not the case. I would basically only try and get my times back down the week before the competition, and as you can maybe guess, that did not work. I was far below my peak, and unless I wanted to keep lying to myself about that, I was going to have to face the truth and actually work on stuff to improve. And finally, my last and possibly most important piece of advice I can give you, and what I think will be the biggest help to anyone in this state, is to keep going to competitions. With the big asterisk, of course, that you have the disposable income and time to do so. A lot can happen at one competition. You can see an inspiring performance from somebody. You can unexpectedly break a personal best, which just might motivate you to keep working on an event. And maybe you'll just meet your new best friend. It might not happen in one competition. It might not even happen in 10. But I assure you that something can and will happen if you keep going to competitions. And with that, I am done. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Do we have, yeah.
What do you do for OCPBL?
Next question.
Hello.
Hello.
What is your biggest goal in your future of cubing?
My biggest goal at this moment is just to keep improving, and that's kind of what the whole point of this was. I think that for a very, very long time, I only had goals that were related to records or setting or getting big competition titles like this one, or worlds, stuff like that. So I think that just now, I'm pretty happy with just improving and seeing myself do better in multiple events.
Hello, I'm wondering whether you considered organizing competitions as a way of basically keeping in touch with cubing and kind of taking a break if you're overwhelmed from practicing.
I guess something a lot of people do, so I think that was kind of my own mindset for a while I was still competing, even though I wasn't expecting to really do well. I might have been lying to myself saying that I still had potential, that I could still get lucky and do well, but I really wasn't practicing enough to make any of that come true. So I think in my own head, just keeping going to competitions was kind of a way to, at the very least, keep myself involved in cubing. So I think that was probably what ended up helping. I kind of talk about this where at one competition, randomly I broke a overall PB in 4x4, and that kind of rekindled my spirit for cubing.
One last question, anyone? We'll go back here.
So when I was going for Skubnar and I'd see it make big jumps, it would demotivate me at times. So I wanted to know, in your experience, did seeing other people improve the records you were going for make you more or less motivated to keep pushing yourself?
I think for like a little while, it always made me a little bit less motivated. I think specifically during COVID, when David Epstein broke the square one world record, when Australia was able to compete before everybody else again, that was very, very disheartening to me, because I felt like that was something that I thought I deserved for a while, which was a very destructive mindset, of course. But I thought I deserved that, and it was very disheartening that somebody who just had the opportunity to compete got it before me. So I was upset for a little while, but eventually I got past that, and I think for a little bit it did motivate me again, but that wasn't enough to keep going. So it took a while to get back into that actually good mindset of continuing practicing.
Awesome. Thanks, Aiden.
Thank you.
And that wraps up our evening. Thanks to all of you for coming and engaging with the seminars. Thanks to those of you who tuned in on the live stream. And we will see all of you tomorrow for day 3.